Welcome everybody to Forza Horizon 4, and today we're taking a look at the 1953 Chevrolet Corvette. Now this was part of the first generation, produced from 1953 to 1962, commonly referred to as a C1 generation, though this version of the Corvette C1 was, in terms of engine and transmission, lasted only from 1953 to 1955, as both were changed in 1956, and then the styling was eventually updated a few years later, having the quad headlamp front that has become notable for this generation. All 1953 models came with polo white paint, red interiors and a black canvas top, though you can't see that in this game because unfortunately Forza doesn't allow you to raise roofs and lower them on convertibles. All of the cars also came with heaters and an AM radio, and for handling purposes they also all came with independent front suspension, though they came with a rigid rear axle with leaf springs at the rear, though that was common on many American cars back in the day. And I really rather like this car in a lot of aspects, to be honest. I really like the interior, if it'll let me get in there. Yeah, I really like the red interior and the mix between red and cream and white, so it's really rather nice. I like the big dial in the middle, and you've got everything that you could really want from a early 50s sports car, really. And I love the colour of the red as well. It's a nice colour of red, and I really like the white as well. It accents the red really rather well as well. It makes the interior stand out all the more. And I really quite like the styling as well. It's not quite as classic as the quad headlamp version of this car later in the years, but I really like its smooth lines. The fact that it's not over dependent on chrome like a lot of cars from the 50s would eventually become. And really looks really rather well proportioned. There's a nice length between on the bonnet side and the rear side, meaning it's really rather well balanced, quite frankly. And for a sports car, it's got a really rather sizable boot as well. Easily get a spare tyre in there if you so need. And but the big problem with this car is the performance and the engine that is a result of that. But an even bigger problem, if you had one of these in real life, was the fact that it had some quality issues in this year of the car. It had the fiberglass body didn't have a good fit and finish. There were also water leaks that were an occurrence, and even worse, during driving, sometimes the doors would open, which really rather reminds me of the Alfred Hitchcock film with Cary Grant, Suspicion, where there was a car chasing that and the door opens, and can't imagine that would be a really rather nice experience. But the engine, even though it's not as good as later years, the engine is still decently powerful for a vehicle from this time. It's a 3.9 litre inline 6 engine producing 160 horsepower and 223 pounds-feet of torque. Now, this version of the car did eventually come with a V8 in 1955, but this inline 6 engine with the gearbox was discontinued after 1955, so that's why this version only lasted 2 years. But the engine is decent. It's about as powerful as a Hudson Hornet from the year previous, while weighing a lot less at 2,900 pounds, but it does have a little bit less torque. But the biggest issue with this car is the gearbox. It only has a 2-speed Power Glide automatic, which for cruising around is alright, I guess, but this is supposed to be a sports car, and a 2-speed gearbox really does not make the most of the engine that it's got going. Now, apparently Chevrolet didn't have a manual transmission that was able to deal with the power and torque that this car had, but I find that to be really rather unbelievable, considering Hudson Hornet, a much smaller company, had the Hudson, should I say, not the Hudson Hornet, that's the make of the car, but Hudson themselves, with the Hornet, had a 3-speed gearbox, which was a manual, which was dealing with the same amount of horsepower but more torque from the year previous. And the likes of Mercedes-Benz, Maserati and Jaguar from all this same period also had manual transmissions on cars that were either more powerful or significantly more powerful than this. I mean, the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, I think it is, the Gullwing one, had 81 horsepower more than this, and that had a manual transmission. So I really don't believe that they didn't have a gearbox ready for this car, and if they didn't, then they clearly were trying to rush this car out to meet demand. So really rather unfortunate, really, that it didn't have the gearbox to meet the power and the the performance, as well as match the image of this car. But nonetheless, let's get out onto the open road and see just what this car can do. So yeah, because of the gearbox, the launch on this is woeful, as you'll see. I'll rev the nuts off it now. As you can see, the gearbox just bogs it down, and it's slowly creeps up towards the rev limit, and then eventually will change gear the once. So yeah, it's a gearbox really that limits everything. It limits the power, limits the torque, doesn't give it the best launch, and yeah, just makes it feel really far more slower than a 160 horsepower, 2,900 pound car should be. Because, you know, the likes of a Maserati from the same period as this had 10 more horsepower, a lot less torque, but because it weighed less and had a better gearbox, it's just a more spirited vehicle, whereas this, yeah, is far more of a laid-back cruiser than a sports car. But this was always meant to be a sports car, so yeah, I can't really, you know, make excuses for its lackadaisical gearbox and the resulting performance, which is not great. 0 to 60 in 11 seconds, 0 to 129 seconds, and it'll do a top speed of 104 miles an hour. Now granted, the acceleration times aren't awful. If it did have a 3-speed or a 4-speed manual gearbox, it would be in the below 10 seconds in terms of 0 to 60. Doubt it would be all that much quicker to 100, but it would certainly have a far better top speed if it had a manual gearbox with at least 3 speeds to it. So yeah, it's really rather disappointing. Now granted, obviously this car got better with a V8 engine in 55, and yeah, eventually got, you know, 290 horsepower when the car got the well-known small block V8 in the later years, in the version that we also have on this game, with the styling also changing. But yeah, it's really a surprise that, you know, people wanted more Corvettes when this was the start of the Corvette, and it's even more surprising that it's lasted as long as it has, considering its poor start with not just the performance but also the quality issues. But thankfully they changed all that and really rather turned it around, because they were selling barely 3,000 of these for the first couple of years. So yeah, and there's only around 200 of these known to still exist. So yeah, they eventually pulled it out of the bag, but this was hardly the best start to a sports car that's lasted well over 50 years. But I do somewhat still enjoy driving it, quite frankly. Even with the gearbox, it's still a decent spirited drive. I like the sound of the engine, which, you know, is a different kind of engine that you'd expect from a Corvette. So it's, you know, it's a bit unique in that regard, that it's not making the typical V8 noise. But yeah, if they just had the better gearbox, I could forgive the lack of power in comparison to other sports cars from the time. I could forgive, you know, the fact it doesn't weigh as little as, you know, say a Maserati from the same period as well, if it had the better gearbox. Now granted, I could swap one in and make it a whole lot better, which, you know, I probably will do once I've finished this review, and it will surely make it for a better car. But yeah, I can see why a lot of people were disappointed when this was originally released, because yeah, had a lot going for it. Looks, general lack of weight, decent amount of power from a decently sized engine, but at the end of the day, the gearbox really did let it down. And yeah, even though it does have front independent suspension, the rigid rear suspension with leaf springs does make it a little bit tricky in terms of oversteer at times if you're really pushing it. But yeah, handling on the whole is alright, especially for a car that isn't dealing with all that much power or speed. But yeah, the potential was clearly there, and yeah, they fulfilled that potential eventually. Just a shame that it didn't do it from the start. Nonetheless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.